Hello everyone. Before we start, make sure to like and subscribe to the channel and leave a comment with where you're from and what time you're watching. That way, YouTube will keep showing you stories just like this one. Now, let's begin. I've been driving long-haul trucks for almost 15 years now. I've seen a lot of strange things on the road, things that stick with you long after you've delivered your cargo and gone home. But nothing, and I mean nothing, compares to what happened to me on a stretch of Highway 50 in Nevada back in the winter of 2019. It was around 2 in the morning, and I was hauling a load of electronics from Sacramento to Denver. The road was empty, just endless black asphalt cutting through the desert. No streetlights, no other vehicles, just me and the hum of my engine. The temperature had dropped below freezing, and my breath was fogging up the windshield even with the heat cranked up. That's when I saw her standing on the side of the road. At first, I thought my eyes were playing tricks on me. Out here in the middle of nowhere, you don't expect to see anyone, let alone a woman in a white dress. No jacket, no bag, nothing. Just standing there with her thumb out, illuminated by my headlights like some kind of ghost. I should have kept driving. Every instinct in my body told me to keep my foot on that gas pedal and not look back. But I've always had a soft spot for people in trouble, and this woman looked like she was in serious danger of freezing to death. So I slowed down, pulled over onto the shoulder, and watched her in my side mirror as she walked toward the cab. She moved slowly, deliberately, her bare feet making no sound on the gravel. The white dress she wore was thin, almost see-through, and it billowed slightly in the cold wind. Her hair was long and dark, hanging down past her shoulders, and her face was pale, unnaturally pale. I rolled down my window as she approached. "You okay, ma'am? You need a ride?" She didn't answer right away. She just stared at me with these dark, hollow eyes that seemed to look right through me. Then, after what felt like forever, she nodded slowly. "Get in," I said, unlocking the passenger door. "You're gonna freeze to death out here." She climbed into the cab without a word, moving with a strange, fluid grace that made my skin crawl. Once she was settled in the seat, I got a better look at her. She couldn't have been more than 25, with delicate features and skin so pale it was almost translucent. The white dress clung to her thin frame, and I noticed there were no shoes on her feet, which were dirty and cut up like she'd been walking for miles. "Where are you headed?" I asked, trying to sound friendly despite the unease creeping up my spine. She didn't answer. She just sat there, staring straight ahead through the windshield, her hands folded neatly in her lap. I cleared my throat and tried again. "Look, I'm going to Denver. I can drop you off at the next town if you want. Get you somewhere warm." Still nothing. Not a word. Not even a glance in my direction. I shifted the truck back into gear and pulled onto the highway, telling myself that maybe she was in shock or traumatized from whatever had happened to her out there. People react differently to extreme situations. Maybe she'd been in an accident, or maybe she'd been attacked and managed to escape. Either way, I figured the best thing I could do was get her to the next town and call the police. We drove in silence for about 10 minutes. The only sounds were the rumble of the engine and the occasional whistle of wind against the windows. I kept glancing over at her, trying to figure out what her story was, but she never moved. She just sat there, perfectly still, like a statue. Then I noticed the smell. It was faint at first, just a hint of something rotten like spoiled meat left out in the sun. I wrinkled my nose and cracked the window, thinking maybe it was something outside, roadkill or a dead animal nearby. But the smell didn't go away. If anything, it got stronger, filling the cab with this thick, nauseating stench that made my stomach turn. I looked over at the woman again, and that's when I saw it. Her dress, which had been white when she got in, was now stained. Dark, wet stains spread across the fabric, starting at her chest and moving down toward her lap. At first I thought maybe she was bleeding, but the color was wrong. It was too dark, almost black, and it had this oily sheen to it. "Ma'am," I said, my voice shaking. "Are you hurt? Do you need a doctor?" She turned her head slowly, and for the first time she looked directly at me. Her eyes, which had been dark and hollow before, were now completely black. No whites, no pupils, just solid black pools that seemed to absorb the light. My heart started pounding in my chest. I wanted to pull over, to tell her to get out, but I couldn't move. It was like my body had locked up, my hands frozen on the steering wheel. "You shouldn't have stopped," she said, her voice barely more than a whisper. The temperature in the cab dropped suddenly, and I could see my breath misting in the air. The windshield started to fog up, and the radio, which had been playing classic rock, switched to static. I fumbled for the volume knob, trying to turn it off, but it wouldn't budge. "Who are you?" I managed to choke out. She smiled, and it was the most terrifying thing I've ever seen. Her lips pulled back to reveal teeth that were too sharp, too white, and her mouth seemed to stretch wider than it should have been able to. "Does it matter?" she asked. I slammed on the brakes, the truck skidding to a halt in the middle of the highway. I didn't care if another vehicle came up behind us. I just needed her out of my truck. "Get out," I said, my voice barely steady. "Get out now." She laughed, a low, hollow sound that echoed through the cab. Then, without warning, she was gone. The passenger seat was empty, the door still locked, like she'd never been there at all, but the smell remained. And so did the wet, oily stains on the seat where she'd been sitting. I sat there for a long time, my hands shaking on the steering wheel, trying to make sense of what had just happened. Eventually, I forced myself to get moving again, telling myself it had been a hallucination, that I'd been driving too long without sleep, but deep down I knew that wasn't true. I drove straight through to Denver without stopping, and the next day I took my truck to a detailing shop to get the passenger seat cleaned. The guy working there asked me what the stain was, said he'd never seen anything like it. I didn't have an answer for him. I still drive long haul, but I don't pick up hitchhikers anymore. Not after that night. And every time I pass that stretch of Highway 50, I keep my eyes straight ahead and my foot on the gas. Because I know she's still out there, waiting for someone else to stop. I've been hauling freight across the Midwest for the better part of 20 years. In that time, I've picked up maybe a dozen hitchhikers, most of them down on their luck but harmless enough. I always figured it was the right thing to do, helping someone out when they needed it. But after what happened on Interstate 80 in Iowa, I'll never pick up another stranger again. It was late October, around midnight, and I was driving a load of furniture from Chicago to Omaha. The weather had turned nasty, rain coming down in sheets so thick I could barely see 10 feet in front of me. My windshield wipers were working overtime, squeaking back and forth, but they weren't doing much good. I was just outside of Des Moines when I saw him standing on the shoulder, soaked to the bone and waving his arms. He was wearing a dark jacket and jeans, and even from a distance I could tell he looked desperate. I slowed down and pulled over, figuring the poor bastard had probably broken down somewhere and was trying to get to the next town. He jogged up to the passenger side, and I leaned over to unlock the door. "Get in before you drown out there," I called out. He climbed into the cab, water dripping everywhere, and pulled the door shut behind him. I got my first good look at him then, and something about him immediately put me on edge. He was tall, maybe 6'2" or 6'3", with broad shoulders and long arms that seemed just a little too long for his body. His dark hair was plastered to his head from the rain, and his clothes were filthy, covered in mud and what looked like grass stains. But it was his face that really bothered me, or rather, the lack of it. I know that sounds crazy, but hear me out. When I looked at him, I couldn't make out any distinct features. It was like his face was blurred, like someone had taken an eraser to a photograph. I could see the general shape of a head and I knew there were eyes and a nose and a mouth somewhere, but I couldn't focus on any of them. Every time I tried, my vision would slide away, like my brain refused to process what it was seeing. "Thanks for stopping," he said, his voice low and rough. "I've been out there for hours." "No problem," I said, trying to shake off the unease. "Where are you headed?" "West," he said simply. "Just west." I nodded and pulled back onto the highway, telling myself I was imagining things. It was late, I was tired, and the rain was playing tricks on my eyes. That was all. We drove in silence for a while. The only sound the steady drum of rain on the roof of the cab. I kept my eyes on the road, but I could feel him watching me. Every time I glanced over, he was staring at me with that blurred, featureless face, and it took everything in me not to tell him to get out. "You do this often?" he asked suddenly. "Do what?" "Pick up strangers." I shrugged. "Sometimes, if they look like they need help." He nodded slowly, his head tilting to one side in a way that seemed unnatural. "That's kind of you. Most people wouldn't stop. They're too afraid." Afraid of what? He didn't answer right away. Instead, he reached up and wiped at his face with one hand, like he was trying to clear away water. But his hand came away dry, and when I looked at him again, I realized the rain on his clothes had stopped dripping. In fact, his jacket and jeans looked completely dry now, like he'd never been wet at all. "You ever wonder what happens to people who disappear?" he asked, his voice soft. My hands tightened on the steering wheel. "What do you mean?" "You know, people who go missing, walk out of their house one day and never come back, get in a car with a stranger and are never seen again." He paused, and I swear I could feel him smile even though I couldn't see his face. "Where do you think they go?" I didn't answer. My mouth had gone dry, and my heart was pounding so hard I thought it might burst out of my chest. "I think they end up in places like this," he continued, gesturing vaguely toward the windshield. "Dark roads in the middle of nowhere. Places where no one can hear them scream." I wanted to pull over, to tell him to get the hell out of my truck, but I couldn't. My body wouldn't respond. It was like I was frozen, my hands locked on the wheel, my foot pressed to the gas pedal. "You seem like a good man," he said, leaning closer, "the kind of person who tries to do the right thing. But you know what's funny? Good people make the best victims. They're the ones who stop, the ones who let strangers into their cars." His voice was right next to my ear now, and I could feel his breath on my neck, cold and damp. The smell hit me then, the same rotten, decaying stench I'd smelled before, and I realized it was coming from him. "Who are you?" I managed to whisper. He laughed, a low, guttural sound that didn't sound human. "Does it matter?" The radio turned on by itself, blaring static so loud it hurt my ears. The lights inside the cab flickered, and the temperature dropped so suddenly I could see my breath misting in the air. I tried to scream, but no sound came out, and then, just as suddenly as it had started, it stopped. The radio went silent. The lights came back on. And when I looked over at the passenger seat, it was empty. I slammed on the brakes, the truck skidding to a stop on the wet highway. I sat there for a long time, my whole body shaking, staring at the empty seat. There was no sign he'd ever been there. No water, no mud, nothing. But when I looked down at the center console, I saw something that made my blood run cold. Carved into the plastic in rough, jagged letters were the words, "Thank you for stopping." I reported it to the police the next day, but they didn't believe me. Said I'd probably been hallucinating from exhaustion. Maybe they're right. Maybe I imagined the whole thing, but I still see that message every time I get in my truck. And every time I pass a hitchhiker on the side of the road, I keep driving. I've been a trucker for most of my adult life, driving routes all over the country, I've hauled everything from groceries to construction equipment, and I've seen just about every kind of person you can imagine. But nothing prepared me for the night I picked up a young girl on Route 66 in New Mexico. It was early summer, around 9 at night, and I was heading east from Albuquerque toward Amarillo. The sun had just set, and the desert stretched out on either side of the highway, dark and empty. I had been driving for about 6 hours straight, and I was looking forward to stopping at a truck stop in Tucumcari for the night. That's when I saw her standing on the side of the road. She couldn't have been more than 16 or 17, wearing a faded blue hoodie and ripped jeans. Her hair was pulled back in a messy ponytail, and she had a small backpack slung over one shoulder. She wasn't waving or trying to flag me down, just standing there with her thumb out, like she was waiting for someone. I slowed down and pulled over, rolling down my window. "You need a ride?" She nodded, her face expressionless. "Yeah, thanks." I unlocked the door, and she climbed into the cab, tossing her backpack onto the floor. Up close, she looked even younger, with pale skin and dark circles under her eyes like she hadn't slept in days. "Where are you headed?" I asked as I pulled back onto the highway. "Amarillo," she said quietly. "Lucky for you, that's where I'm going. What's your name?" She hesitated before answering. "Emily." "Well, Emily, I'm Don. You running away from home or something?" She didn't answer right away. She just stared out the window at the dark desert, her fingers picking at the strap of her backpack. "Something like that," she finally said. I didn't push her. I figured she'd had a fight with her parents or was dealing with some kind of trouble at school. Either way, it wasn't really my business. I just wanted to get her somewhere safe. We drove in silence for about half an hour. I kept the radio on low, some country station playing old Garth Brooks songs, and Emily sat perfectly still, her eyes fixed on the road ahead. Then she spoke, her voice so quiet I almost didn't hear her. "Do you believe in ghosts?" I glanced over at her, surprised. "Ghosts? Can't say I do. Why?" She didn't answer. Instead, she reached up and pulled down the collar of her hoodie, revealing a dark, bruised line around her neck. It looked like a rope burn, raw and angry, and my stomach dropped. "Jesus," I said. "What happened to you?" She pulled the collar back up and looked at me with those hollow, tired eyes. "I didn't run away," she said. "I died." My blood went cold. I wanted to laugh, to tell her she was full of it, but something about the way she said it, the flat, emotionless tone, made me believe her. "What do you mean you died?" I asked, my voice shaking. 3 days ago," she said. "My boyfriend and I got into a fight. He got drunk and he didn't mean to do it, but he did. And now I'm stuck." I couldn't speak. I just stared at her, my hands gripping the steering wheel so hard my knuckles turned white. "I've been trying to get home," she continued, "but every time I get close I end up back here, on this road, waiting for someone to pick me up. I should have pulled over. I should have told her to get out, but I couldn't. Because deep down, I knew she was telling the truth. "What do you want from me?" I whispered. She turned to look at me. For the first time, I saw tears in her eyes. "I just want to go home. Please, just take me home." I didn't know what else to do, so I kept driving. We didn't talk after that. Emily just sat there, staring out the window, her hands folded in her lap. When we reached Amarillo, she directed me to a quiet neighborhood on the outskirts of town. The houses were small and run down, with overgrown lawns and peeling paint. She pointed to a yellow house at the end of the street. "That's it," she said. "That's my house." I pulled up to the curb and put the truck in park. Emily grabbed her backpack and opened the door, but before she got out, she looked back at me. "Thank you," she said. "You're a good person." And then she was gone, walking up the driveway toward the house. I watched her until she reached the front door, and then I saw something that made my heart stop. She walked right through the door, didn't open it, didn't knock, just passed through it like it wasn't even there. I sat there for a long time, staring at that house, trying to make sense of what I'd just seen. Eventually, I drove away, my hands shaking on the wheel. The next morning, I looked up the address online. According to the news, a 17-year-old girl named Emily Lawson had been found dead in that house 3 days earlier. Her boyfriend had been arrested for her murder. I still think about her sometimes, about the way she looked at me with those sad, hollow eyes, and I wonder if she ever made it home. I've been driving trucks for nearly 30 years, and in that time, I've learned to trust my instincts. When something feels off, it usually is. But there was one night, back in the fall of 2017, when I ignored that little voice in my head, and I've regretted it ever since. I was hauling a load of auto parts from Detroit to Nashville, driving down Interstate 65 through Kentucky. It was around 3 a.m, and the highway was completely deserted. No other trucks, no cars, just me and the endless stretch of black asphalt cutting through the darkness. I was about an hour south of Louisville when I saw him standing on the shoulder, illuminated by my headlights. He was an older man, maybe in his 60s, wearing a worn flannel shirt and jeans. He had a scraggly gray beard and a baseball cap pulled low over his eyes. And he was holding a cardboard sign that read, Nashville. Something about him immediately made me uneasy. Maybe it was the way he stood perfectly still, not moving a muscle, or maybe it was the fact that he was out here in the middle of nowhere at 3 a.m. Either way, every instinct I had told me to keep driving, but I didn't. I told myself I was being paranoid, that the old man probably just needed a ride, and I pulled over. He walked up to the passenger side and climbed in without saying a word. Up close, I could see his face was weathered and lined, his eyes hidden in the shadow of his cap. He smelled like dirt and sweat, and his clothes were stained and torn. "Heading to Nashville?" I asked, trying to sound friendly. He nodded but didn't say anything. "Well, you're in luck. That's where I'm going. Name's Carl." He still didn't respond. He just sat there, his hands resting on his lap, staring straight ahead through the windshield. I shifted the truck into gear and pulled back onto the highway, telling myself that maybe he was just shy or didn't speak English. But as we drove, the silence became oppressive, heavy, like a physical weight pressing down on me. I tried to make conversation a few more times, asking him where he was from and what he was doing out here so late, but he never answered. He just sat there, perfectly still, like a statue. After about 20 minutes, I noticed something strange. He hadn't moved, not once. He hadn't shifted in his seat, hadn't scratched his face, hadn't even blinked as far as I could tell. It was like he wasn't even breathing. I glanced over at him. That's when I saw his hands. They were covered in dirt, the fingernails black and broken like he'd been digging in the ground. And there was something else, something that made my stomach turn. His fingers were too long, the joints bending at odd angles, and his skin had this grayish, waxy quality to it that didn't look right. "Hey," I said, my voice shaking. "You okay?" He didn't respond. He just kept staring straight ahead, his face expressionless. I tried to swallow, but my mouth had gone dry. "Look, if you're not feeling well, I can drop you off at the next exit. There's a hospital in—" He turned his head slowly, and for the first time I got a good look at his face. His eyes were wrong. They were too big, too round, and they didn't have any pupils. Just solid white orbs that seemed to glow faintly in the darkness of the cab. His mouth was slightly open, revealing teeth that were too sharp, too many, and his skin had that same grayish, waxy texture as his hands. I wanted to scream, but no sound came out. I wanted to pull over and kick him out, but my body wouldn't respond. All I could do was stare at him, my heart pounding in my chest as he slowly reached out and placed one of those long, twisted hands on my arm. His touch was cold, so cold it felt like my skin was burning. I could feel the chill spreading up my arm, into my shoulder, creeping toward my chest. "What do you want?" I managed to choke out. He leaned in close, his face inches from mine, and I could smell the decay on his breath, the stench of something that had been dead for a long time. "Drive," he whispered, his voice barely audible, like wind through dead leaves. I didn't have a choice. My hands moved on their own, gripping the steering wheel, keeping the truck on the road. I couldn't look away from him, couldn't move, couldn't do anything but drive. We continued like that for what felt like hours, though it was probably only 20 or 30 minutes. He never let go of my arm, and the cold kept spreading until my entire body felt numb. Then, without warning, he let go. The warmth came flooding back, and I gasped, my lungs filling with air like I'd been holding my breath. I looked over at the passenger seat, but he was gone. The door was still closed, still locked like he'd never been there at all. But the smell remained, that thick, rotten stench of decay. And when I looked down at my arm, I saw the mark where he'd touched me. My skin was pale and discolored, and there were 5 distinct fingerprints burned into my flesh, dark and bruised. I pulled over at the next rest stop and sat there for a long time, trying to calm down. I considered calling the police, but what would I tell them? That I'd picked up a ghost? That some kind of creature had gotten into my truck and touched me? Eventually, I forced myself to keep driving. I delivered my load in Nashville, and the next day, I went to a doctor to get my arm checked out. He said it looked like frostbite, which didn't make any sense since it was 50 degrees outside that night. The marks faded after a few weeks, but I can still feel them sometimes, especially when it's cold, and I still see him in my dreams, sitting in the passenger seat with those glowing white eyes, whispering the same word over and over. Drive. I've been hauling freight for close to 18 years now, and I've driven through just about every state in this country. Most of the time it's boring. Long stretches of highway, the same gas stations, the same truck stops. But every once in a while, something happens that reminds you just how strange the world can be. This particular story happened in the winter of 2016, somewhere in the backroads of West Virginia. I was driving a load of machinery from Pittsburgh to Charleston, and I'd decided to take a shortcut through the mountains to save some time. It was a stupid decision, looking back on it, but I was running behind schedule and didn't want to deal with my dispatcher giving me hell. The road I took was narrow and winding, cutting through dense forest on either side. There were no streetlights, no houses, nothing but trees and darkness. It was around midnight, and a light snow had started to fall, making the road slick and treacherous. I was going slow, maybe 30 miles an hour, when I saw them standing in the middle of the road. A man and a woman, both dressed in what looked like old-fashioned clothing. The man wore a dark suit and a hat, and the woman had on a long dress with a shawl wrapped around her shoulders. They were standing perfectly still, side by side, like they were waiting for something. I slammed on the brakes, the truck skidding to a stop about 20 feet from them. My heart was pounding as I stared at them through the windshield, trying to figure out what the hell they were doing out here. The man raised his hand and waved, a slow, deliberate gesture. Then he pointed to the side of the road, and where I could see an old pickup truck parked on the shoulder, its hood up. I rolled down my window and called out, "You folks need help?" The man nodded and started walking toward me, the woman following close behind. As they got closer, I could see their faces more clearly, and something about them made my skin crawl. They looked normal enough at first glance, but there was something off about them. Their skin was too pale, almost gray, and their eyes had this vacant, empty look to them. The man's suit was old and tattered, with holes in the fabric, and the woman's dress was stained and torn. "Our truck broke down," the man said, his voice flat and emotionless. "We need a ride to the nearest town." I hesitated. Every instinct I had was screaming at me to say no, to drive away and leave them there. But I couldn't just abandon them in the middle of nowhere in the snow. "Get in," I said, unlocking the passenger door. They climbed into the cab, the woman sitting in the middle and the man on the far side. Up close, they smelled like earth and mildew, and I noticed their clothes were damp, like they'd been out in the rain. "Where's the nearest town?" I asked, pulling back onto the road. "Glenville," the man said. "About 10 miles south." I nodded and kept driving, trying to ignore the unease creeping up my spine. The woman sat perfectly still, her hands folded in her lap, and the man stared straight ahead, his face expressionless. We drove in silence for a few minutes, the only sound the crunch of snow under my tires. Then the woman spoke, her voice soft and distant. "Do you know what year it is?" I glanced over at her, confused. "What year? It's 2016. She nodded slowly, like she was processing the information. "We've been waiting a long time." "Waiting for what?" I asked. She didn't answer. Instead, she turned to look at me, and I saw something in her eyes that made my blood run cold. There was no life in them, no spark, just empty, hollow voids. "For someone to stop," the man said. I wanted to pull over, to tell them to get out, but I couldn't. My hands were locked on the wheel and my foot was pressed to the gas pedal. It was like my body wasn't my own anymore. "What do you want?" I managed to whisper. The man smiled, and it was the most unsettling thing I'd ever seen. His lips pulled back to reveal teeth that were yellowed and broken, and his eyes, like the woman's, were empty and lifeless. "We just want to go home," he said. The temperature in the cab dropped suddenly, and I could see my breath misting in the air. The radio turned on by itself, blaring static, and the lights inside the cab flickered. "Where's home?" I asked, my voice barely audible. "Glenville," the woman said. "We died there, a long time ago." My heart was pounding so hard I thought it might explode. I wanted to scream, to do something, anything, but I was paralyzed. "You're going to take us there," the man said, "and then you're going to forget you ever saw us." I don't remember much of what happened after that. It's like my memory just stops, like someone hit pause on a recording. The next thing I knew, I was parked on the side of the road, the engine still running, and the passenger seat was empty. I sat there for a long time, trying to piece together what had happened. I checked my GPS, and according to it, I was just outside Glenville, but I had no memory of driving there, no memory of the couple getting out. The next day, I did some research on Glenville. Turns out, back in the 1950s, a couple had been killed in a car accident on that same road I'd been driving on. Their names were Henry and Margaret Caldwell, and according to the reports, their bodies were never found. I still drive through West Virginia sometimes, but I always stick to the main highways now. And if I ever see someone standing in the middle of the road at night, I keep driving. There are some things you see on the road that stay with you forever, things that don't make sense, that defy explanation. This is one of those stories. It was late spring, around 10 at night, and I was driving through rural Georgia on Highway 441, heading south toward Valdosta. I'd been on the road for about 8 hours, hauling a load of medical supplies, and I was looking forward to stopping for the night at a motel I knew just outside town. The road was quiet, with only the occasional car passing in the opposite direction. The air was warm and humid, and I had my window cracked open, letting in the smell of pine trees and wet earth. That's when I saw the boy standing on the side of the road. He looked to be about 12 or 13 years old, wearing a dirty white t-shirt and jeans. His left arm was wrapped in a makeshift sling. and he was waving his right arm frantically, trying to flag me down. I slowed down and pulled over, my protective instincts kicking in. A kid that young shouldn't be out here alone, especially not at this time of night. I rolled down my window. "Hey, buddy, you okay? What are you doing out here?" He ran up to the truck, his face pale and streaked with tears. "Please, mister, you gotta help me. My mom, she's hurt real bad. Our car went off the road back there." He pointed behind him, toward a narrow dirt road that branched off from the highway, disappearing into the woods. "How far back?" I asked. "Not far. Maybe a quarter mile. Please, she's bleeding a lot. I think she's dying." I didn't hesitate. I grabbed my flashlight and first aid kit from behind the seat and told the boy to get in. He climbed into the cab, wincing as he tried to hold his injured arm steady. "What happened to your arm?" I asked as I turned onto the dirt road. "I hurt it when the car crashed," he said, his voice shaking. "It hurts real bad." I followed the dirt road deeper into the woods, my headlights cutting through the darkness. The trees pressed in on either side, their branches forming a canopy overhead, and the road was rutted and uneven, making the truck bounce and jolt. After about 5 minutes, the boy spoke up. "It's just up ahead, around that bend." I slowed down and rounded the curve, and that's when I saw it. An old sedan, crumpled against a tree, the front end completely smashed in. The windshield was shattered, and the driver's side door was hanging open. I put the truck in park and grabbed my flashlight, jumping out of the cab. "Stay here," I told the boy. "I'll check on your mom." I ran toward the car, my heart pounding, and shone my flashlight inside. The driver's seat was empty. No one was there. No blood, no sign of an accident, nothing. I turned back toward the truck, confused, and that's when I realized something was wrong. The boy was standing outside the cab now, his injured arm hanging limply at his side. But he wasn't looking at me. He was staring at the car, his face expressionless. "Where's your mom?" I called out. He didn't answer. He just stood there, perfectly still, his eyes fixed on the wrecked sedan. I walked back toward him, the beam of my flashlight sweeping across the ground. That's when I saw the grave. It was just off to the side of the road, partially hidden by overgrown weeds. A simple wooden cross marked the spot, with a name carved into it, Jacob Turner, 1998-2011. My blood ran cold. I looked back at the boy, and that's when I saw it. His left arm, the one in the sling, wasn't just injured. It was twisted at an unnatural angle, the bone jutting out through the skin. "You're not real," I whispered. He finally looked at me, and for the first time I saw the sadness in his eyes. "I've been waiting," he said quietly. "Waiting for someone to stop." "What do you want?" I asked, my voice shaking. "I just want to go home," he said, "but I can't remember where it is." I didn't know what to say. I just stood there, staring at him, my mind racing to make sense of what was happening. Then, without warning, he was gone. The road was empty, the wrecked car still there, but the boy had vanished. I got back in my truck and drove away as fast as I could, my hands shaking on the wheel. The next day, I looked up Jacob Turner online. According to the reports, he and his mother had died in a car accident on Highway 441 back in 2011. Their car had gone off the road and crashed into a tree, and both of them had been killed instantly. I still think about him sometimes, about the way he looked at me with those sad, empty eyes, and I wonder if he's still out there, waiting for someone to help him find his way home. I've picked up a lot of hitchhikers over the years, but I've never had one know my name before I told them. That alone should have been enough to make me keep driving, but I didn't, and that decision haunts me to this day. It was late August, around 11 at night, and I was driving through eastern Montana on Interstate 94, heading toward Billings. The night was clear, with a full moon hanging low in the sky, casting everything in this eerie silver light. I was about 20 miles outside of Miles City when I saw her standing on the shoulder, her thumb out. She was middle-aged, maybe in her 40s, with long dark hair and a leather jacket. She had a duffel bag slung over her shoulder, and she looked like she'd been walking for a while. I pulled over and rolled down my window. "Need a ride?" She smiled, and there was something about that smile that made my skin crawl. "Thanks, Jack. I was hoping you'd stop." My blood went cold. "How do you know my name?" She opened the door and climbed into the cab, tossing her duffel bag onto the floor. "Lucky guess," she said, still smiling. I wanted to tell her to get out, but something stopped me. Maybe it was curiosity, maybe it was stubbornness, but I pulled back onto the highway and kept driving. "So where are you headed?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. "Same place you are," she said. "Billings?" I glanced over at her, and that's when I noticed her eyes. They were dark, almost black, and they reflected the light in a way that didn't seem natural. "What's your name?" I asked. "Does it matter?" "I'd like to know who I'm giving a ride to." She laughed, a low, hollow sound that made my stomach turn. "You can call me Sarah." We drove in silence for a while, and I tried to focus on the road, but I could feel her watching me. Every time I glanced over, she was staring at me with those dark, unnatural eyes, that same unsettling smile on her face. "You've been driving for a long time, haven't you, Jack?" she said suddenly. "Yeah, about 20 years. That's a long time to be alone. Don't you ever get lonely?" I didn't answer. I didn't like where this conversation was going. "I've been alone for a long time too," she continued. "Longer than you can imagine. And you know what I've learned? People like us, we're drawn to the road. We're searching for something, but we never find it." "What are you talking about?" I asked. She leaned back in her seat, her eyes never leaving me. "You know exactly what I'm talking about. You feel it, don't you? That emptiness, that sense that something's missing." I wanted to argue, to tell her she was wrong, but I couldn't, because deep down, I knew she was right. "Who are you?" I whispered. She smiled again, and this time I saw her teeth. They were too white, too sharp, and there were too many of them. "I'm the thing that waits in the dark," she said. "The thing that people like you pick up when they're feeling lost. And now, Jack, you're mine." The temperature in the cab dropped suddenly, and I could see my breath misting in the air. The radio turned on by itself, blaring static, and the lights flickered. I tried to pull over, but my hands wouldn't move. They were locked on the steering wheel like they'd been glued there. "What do you want from me?" I managed to choke out. She leaned in close, her face inches from mine. "I want you to drive, forever, just like all the others." I don't know how long we drove like that. It felt like hours, maybe days. All I remember is the sound of static, the smell of decay, and her voice whispering in my ear. Then, suddenly, I was alone. The sun was rising, and I was parked at a rest stop just outside Billings. The passenger seat was empty, and there was no sign she'd ever been there. But when I looked in the rearview mirror, I saw something that made my heart stop. Written in the dust on my back window in the same jagged handwriting I'd seen before were the words, "See you soon, Jack. I still drive trucks, but I don't pick up hitchhikers anymore. And every time I pass someone on the side of the road, I can't help but wonder if it's her, waiting for me to stop." I've been a long-haul trucker for over 25 years, and I've seen just about everything you can imagine on the road. But nothing, and I mean nothing, has ever unnerved me quite like the night I picked up two little girls at a crossroads in rural Louisiana. It was late September, around 2 in the morning, and I was driving south on Highway 165, hauling a load of construction materials from Monroe to Lafayette. The night was hot and sticky, with a thick fog rolling in off the bayou, reducing visibility to almost nothing. I was going slow, maybe 40 miles an hour, when I saw them standing at the intersection of 2 dirt roads, illuminated by my headlights. 2 identical little girls, maybe 8 or 9 years old, both wearing matching white dresses. They had long blonde hair that hung down past their shoulders, and they were holding hands, staring directly at my truck with these unnaturally wide eyes. I slammed on the brakes, my heart pounding. What the hell were 2 little kids doing out here in the middle of the night? I rolled down my window and leaned out. "Hey, are you girls okay? Where are your parents?" They didn't answer. They just stood there, perfectly still, staring at me with those wide, unblinking eyes. I put the truck in park and climbed out, grabbing my flashlight. As I walked toward them, I noticed something strange. The fog seemed to part around them like they were standing in a bubble of clear air. "Are you lost?" I asked, kneeling down to their level. "Do you need help?" Finally, one of them spoke, her voice high and sing-song. "We've been waiting for you." I blinked. "Waiting for me? What do you mean?" The other girl smiled, and it was the creepiest thing I'd ever seen. Her lips pulled back too far, revealing teeth that seemed too sharp for a child. "You're supposed to take us home," she said. "Where's home?" I asked, trying to keep my voice calm. "You'll know when we get there," the first girl said. Every instinct I had was screaming at me to get back in my truck and drive away, but I couldn't just leave 2 little kids out here in the middle of nowhere. So I led them back to the truck and helped them climb into the cab. They sat next to each other on the passenger seat, their hands still clasped together, their eyes fixed straight ahead. Up close, I could see their skin was pale, almost translucent, and their white dresses were pristine, like they'd never been worn. "What are your names?" I asked as I pulled back onto the highway. "I'm Lily," the first girl said. "I'm Rose," the second girl said. And where are your parents, Lily and Rose?" They both turned to look at me at the same time, their movements perfectly synchronized. "They're waiting for us." I nodded and kept driving, trying to ignore the unease crawling up my spine. The fog had gotten thicker, and I could barely see the road ahead. The only sound was the rumble of the engine and the occasional creak of the truck's frame. After about 10 minutes, Rose spoke up. "Do you have any children?" "No," I said. "Never got married." "That's sad," Lily said. "Children are a gift." I glanced over at them, and that's when I noticed something that made my stomach drop. They weren't breathing, their chests weren't moving, and I couldn't see any rise or fall, no sign of life at all. "Where exactly am I taking you?" I asked, my voice shaking. "Turn left at the next crossroads," Rose said. I followed their directions, turning onto a narrow dirt road that cut through a dense swamp. The fog was so thick I could barely see 10 feet ahead, and the trees pressed in on either side, their branches forming a twisted canopy overhead. "Keep going," Lily said. We drove deeper into the swamp, the road getting narrower and more treacherous. I could hear the sound of water dripping, the croak of frogs, the rustle of unseen creatures in the underbrush. Then, suddenly, they spoke in unison, their voices overlapping in a way that made my skin crawl. "Stop here." I slammed on the brakes and the truck skidded to a halt in the middle of the road. I looked around, but all I could see was fog and trees. "Where are we?" I asked. "Home," they said together. They opened the door and climbed out, their movements perfectly synchronized. I watched as they walked toward the trees, hand in hand, disappearing into the fog. I sat there for a long time, my heart pounding, trying to make sense of what had just happened. Finally, I forced myself to get out and look around. That's when I saw it. A small, crumbling house, barely visible through the fog. The windows were broken, the roof had caved in, and the front porch was rotting away, and standing in the doorway were two figures, shadowy and indistinct. I couldn't make out their features, but I knew, somehow, that they were Lily and Rose's parents. I got back in my truck and drove away as fast as I could, not stopping until I reached Lafayette. The next day, I did some research and found out that back in the 1960s, two young girls named Lily and Rose Devereaux had drowned in the bayou near that same Crossroads. Their bodies were never found. I still drive through Louisiana sometimes, but I always avoid that stretch of Highway 165. And if I ever see two little girls standing at a crossroads in the middle of the night, I'm not stopping. There's a reason most truckers don't pick up hitchhikers anymore. It's not because we're heartless. It's because we've heard the stories. We know what can happen. But sometimes, you see someone who looks so desperate, so in need of help, that you can't help but stop. That was my mistake. It was early November, around 4 in the morning, and I was driving through southern Colorado on Highway 160, heading toward Durango. The temperature had dropped below freezing, and a light snow was falling, covering the road in a thin layer of white. I'd been driving for about 12 hours straight, and I was exhausted. I was thinking about pulling over at the next rest stop when I saw him standing on the shoulder, waving his arms. He was a big guy, maybe 6'4", wearing a heavy coat and boots. He looked like he'd been out in the cold for a while, and his breath was misting in the frigid air. I pulled over and rolled down my window. "You need help." He jogged up to the truck, his face red from the cold. "Man, thank God you stopped. My truck ran out of gas about 2 miles back. I've been walking for over an hour, and I haven't seen a single car." I nodded toward the passenger side. "Get in. I'll take you to the next gas station." He climbed into the cab, bringing with him the smell of cold air and diesel fuel. "I really appreciate this, man. I thought I was going to freeze to death out there." "No problem," I said, pulling back onto the highway. "What's your name?" "Frank," he said, extending a hand. "Frank Morrison." "I'm Dale," I said, shaking his hand. His grip was strong, almost painfully so, and his palm was rough and calloused. We drove in silence for a few minutes, and I kept glancing over at him, trying to figure out why something about him was making me uneasy. He looked normal enough, just a regular guy who'd had some bad luck. But there was something in his eyes, something cold and calculating, that put me on edge. "So what do you do, Dale?" he asked, his voice casual. "I'm a trucker. Been doing it for about 15 years. Must be lonely driving all by yourself." "Sometimes, but I like it. Gives me time to think." He nodded slowly, his eyes never leaving me. "You ever pick up hitchhikers before?" "A few times. Not as often as I used to." "Why's that?" I shrugged. "World's a dangerous place. You never know who you're gonna meet out here." He smiled, and there was something about that smile that made my blood run cold. "That's true? You really never do know." The temperature in the cab seemed to drop suddenly, and I noticed Frank had stopped making any movement. He just sat there, perfectly still, his eyes locked on me. "So where's the nearest gas station?" he asked. "About 10 miles up the road. There's a little town called Pagosa Springs. We'll be there in about 15 minutes. "Good," he said. "That's good." We drove in silence again, and I tried to focus on the road, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was very wrong. Frank hadn't moved since he got in the truck. He hadn't scratched his face, hadn't shifted in his seat, hadn't even blinked. Then I noticed his hands. They were resting on his lap, and in the dim light of the cab, I could see they were stained dark. At first, I thought it was just grease or dirt, but as I looked closer, I realized it was blood. Old, dried blood that had seeped into the creases of his skin. "Frank," I said, my voice shaking, "what's that on your hands?" He looked down at his hands, then back at me. That same unsettling smile on his face. Oh, that. Just had a little accident earlier. Nothing to worry about. What kind of accident? He didn't answer right away. He just stared at me, his eyes cold and empty. Then he reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a knife. It was a hunting knife, long and serrated, with a wooden handle stained dark with blood. My heart stopped. I wanted to pull over, to jump out of the truck and run, but I couldn't move. My hands were locked on the steering wheel, my foot frozen on the gas pedal. "Here's the thing, Dale," Frank said, his voice calm and conversational. "I didn't run out of gas. My truck's parked just fine back there. I was waiting for someone like you, someone who'd be stupid enough to stop." "What do you want?" I whispered. He leaned in close, the knife glinting in the dim light. "I want you to keep driving, and when we get to Pagosa Springs, you're going to pull over in a nice, quiet spot, and then we're going to have a little talk." I could feel the cold steel of the knife against my ribs, just enough pressure to remind me it was there. I didn't have a choice. I kept driving, my mind racing, trying to figure out a way out of this. We reached Pagosa Springs about 10 minutes later, and Frank directed me to turn off the highway onto a deserted side road. The snow was falling harder now, and the road was barely visible. "Pull over here," he said, pointing to a spot under a cluster of trees. I put the truck in park, my hands shaking so badly I could barely hold the wheel. Frank reached over and turned off the engine, plunging us into silence. "Now," he said, pressing the knife a little harder against my ribs. "Get out, slowly." I opened the door and climbed out, my legs barely able to support me. Frank followed, keeping the knife trained on me the whole time. "Start walking," he said, gesturing toward the trees. I took a step, then another, my mind screaming at me to do something, anything. That's when I heard it. The sound of sirens in the distance, getting closer. Frank heard it too. His head snapped toward the sound, and for just a second, he was distracted. That's when I ran. I took off into the trees, stumbling through the snow, not daring to look back. I could hear Frank shouting behind me, his footsteps crunching in the snow, but I didn't stop. I just kept running, my lungs burning, my heart pounding. The sirens were getting louder now, and I could see flashing lights through the trees. I burst out onto the highway just as 2 police cars pulled up, their headlights blinding me. The officers jumped out, guns drawn, and I collapsed onto the pavement, gasping for air. They found Frank a few minutes later, trying to flee through the woods. Turns out he was wanted for murder in 3 states, and I wasn't the first person he'd tried to kill. I don't pick up hitchhikers anymore. Not after that night. And every time I drive through Colorado, I can't help but wonder what would have happened if those police cars hadn't shown up when they did. Some encounters on the road don't make sense until much later. Sometimes you meet someone who seems harmless, maybe even helpful, but looking back you realize they knew something you didn't. This is one of those stories. It was early spring, around 7 in the evening, and I was driving through northern Arizona on Highway 89, heading toward Flagstaff. The sun was setting, painting the desert in shades of orange and red, and the air was cool and crisp. I was making good time when I saw him standing on the shoulder, an elderly man with a walking stick and a worn backpack. He looked to be in his 70s or 80s, with a weathered face and white hair that hung down to his shoulders. I pulled over and rolled down my window. "Need a lift?" He nodded, his eyes twinkling. "If you're heading north, I'd be much obliged." I unlocked the door and he climbed in slowly, grunting with effort. Up close, I could see he was Native American, his face deeply lined and his hands gnarled with age. "Name's Thomas," he said, settling into the seat. "Thomas B. Gay." "I'm Mike," I said, pulling back onto the highway. "Where are you headed?" Just up the road a ways, to Tuba City. That's where I'm going. Lucky for you." He smiled. "Luck's got nothing to do with it, son." I glanced over at him, confused, but he didn't elaborate. We drove in silence for a while, and I noticed he kept looking out the window, his expression thoughtful. "You drive this route often?" he asked after a few minutes. "A few times a month?" "Why?" He was quiet for a moment, then said, "There's something you should know about this road, or something most people don't realize." "What's that?" He turned to look at me, his dark eyes serious. "This highway, it's built on old land, sacred land, and sometimes the spirits don't like people passing through." I chuckled, thinking he was pulling my leg. "Spirits, huh?" "I'm not joking," he said, his voice sharp. "You ever pick up anyone else on this road? Anyone who seemed off?" My smile faded. The truth was, I had picked up a few hitchhikers on this route over the years, and some of them had been strange. There was the young woman who wouldn't stop crying, the man who wouldn't speak, and the little boy who'd asked me to take him to a town that didn't exist. "Maybe," I admitted. Thomas nodded. "They're not always what they seem. The spirits, they take different forms. Sometimes they look like people in need. And if you're not careful, they'll lead you somewhere you don't want to go." I wanted to laugh it off, to tell him he was being superstitious, but something in his voice made me believe him. "What should I do if I see someone?" I asked. "Don't stop," he said simply. "No matter how desperate they look, no matter how much they beg, don't stop, because once you let them in, they don't leave." A chill ran down my spine. "What happens if you do stop?" He didn't answer right away. He just stared out the window, his expression distant. Then he said, "You become one of them, trapped on the road, waiting for someone else to make the same mistake." We drove the rest of the way in silence, and when we reached Tuba City, Thomas asked me to drop him off at a small roadside diner. I pulled into the parking lot, and he climbed out slowly, grabbing his walking stick. "Thanks for the ride, Mike," he said. "And remember what I told you. Don't stop for anyone on this road." I nodded, and he walked away, disappearing into the diner. I sat there for a moment, thinking about what he'd said, then shook my head and pulled back onto the highway. That was 5 years ago, and since that night I've seen them. The people standing on the side of Highway 89, their thumbs out, their faces desperate. But I don't stop. Not anymore, because I know what Thomas told me was true, and I'm not about to become one of them. I've been driving trucks for 32 years. I've hauled everything you can imagine, from groceries to hazardous materials, and I've driven through every state in this country at least a dozen times. But nothing, absolutely nothing, prepared me for my last ride as a trucker. It was late October, just a few days before Halloween, and I was driving through eastern Washington on Interstate 90, heading toward Spokane. It was my final run before retirement, and I was looking forward to finally hanging up my keys and spending time with my grandkids. The night was cold and clear, with a full moon casting everything in this eerie silver light. I'd been driving for about 10 hours, and I was tired, but I wanted to push through and get to Spokane before midnight. That's when I saw her standing on the shoulder, right at the edge of my headlights. She was young, maybe in her early 20s, with long red hair and a green jacket. She had a small suitcase at her feet, and she was waving frantically, like she was desperate for someone to stop. I almost kept driving, after everything I'd seen over the years, after all the strange encounters and close calls. I'd learned to trust my instincts, and my instincts were screaming at me to keep going, but it was my last run, my last chance to help someone. So I pulled over. She ran up to the truck, her face flushed with relief. "Oh my God, thank you so much. I've been out here for hours." "Get in," I said, unlocking the door. She climbed into the cab, bringing with her the smell of perfume and something else, something I couldn't quite place. Up close, she was beautiful, with bright green eyes and a smile that seemed genuine. "I'm Sarah," she said, extending a hand. "I'm Tom," I said, shaking her hand. Her grip was firm and her skin was warm. "Where are you headed, Tom?" "Spokane. What about you?" "Same. What are the odds, right?" I nodded and pulled back onto the highway, telling myself everything was fine, that she was just a normal person who needed a ride. But as we drove, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. "So what were you doing out there?" I asked. "My car broke down about 10 miles back," she said. "I've been trying to get a tow truck, but my phone's dead." "You walked 10 miles?" She shrugged. "Didn't have much choice." I glanced over at her, and that's when I noticed her shoes. They were clean, spotless actually, no dirt, no scuffs, nothing. If she'd really walked 10 miles on the shoulder of a highway, her shoes should have been filthy. "So what do you do, Tom?" she asked, changing the subject. "I'm a trucker, have been for over 30 years. This is actually my last run before I retire." "Really? That's exciting. What are you going to do with all your free time?" "Spend it with my family, my grandkids. Maybe do some traveling." She smiled. "That sounds nice." We drove in silence for a while, and I tried to focus on the road, but I couldn't stop thinking about her shoes. And the smell, that strange, unidentifiable smell that seemed to be getting stronger. "Can I ask you something, Tom?" she said suddenly. "Sure. Do you believe in second chances?" I glanced over at her, confused. "What do you mean? Like, if you made a mistake, a really big mistake, do you think you'd get a chance to fix it?" "I don't know. I guess it depends on the mistake." She nodded, her expression thoughtful. "I made a mistake once. A long time ago, and I've been trying to fix it ever since." "What kind of mistake?" She didn't answer. Instead, she turned to look out the window, her hands folded in her lap. We drove for another 10 minutes, and then she spoke again, her voice soft and distant. "Do you ever think about the people you've picked up over the years? The hitchhikers?" "Sometimes," I said. "Do you ever wonder what happened to them? Where they ended up?" I didn't answer. I didn't like where this was going. "I think about it all the time," she said. "About the people who stopped for me, about the choices they made." My heart started pounding. "What are you talking about?" She turned to look at me, and for the first time, I saw something in her eyes that made my blood run cold. They were hollow, empty, like there was nothing behind them. "I'm not really here, Tom," she said quietly. "I haven't been for a long time." "What do you mean?" I whispered. "I died 20 years ago, right here on this highway. A trucker picked me up, just like you did. And when we got to Spokane, he killed me. I wanted to pull over, to tell her to get out, but I couldn't move. My hands were locked on the steering wheel, my body frozen. But I'm still here," she continued. "Still waiting. Still trying to find a way back." "Back to what?" I managed to choke out. "To the moment before I got in that truck, to the moment I made the worst decision of my life." Tears were streaming down her face now, and I could see the pain in her eyes, the anguish. "I've been riding this highway for 20 years, Tom, waiting for someone to help me, and you're my last chance." "What do you want from me?" I whispered. "I want you to remember me," she said. "I want you to tell people my story, so that maybe, just maybe, someone else won't make the same mistake I did." And then she was gone. The passenger seat was empty, the door still locked, like she'd never been there at all, but the smell remained. And when I looked down at the seat, I saw something that made my heart stop. A small, faded photograph. It showed a young woman with red hair and green eyes, smiling at the camera. On the back, written in faded ink, were the words, "Sarah Mitchell, 1975-1994, never forgotten." I pulled over and sat there for a long time, staring at that photograph, trying to make sense of what had just happened. Eventually, I put it in my pocket and continued driving to Spokane. That was my last ride as a trucker. I retired the next day just like I'd planned, but I never forgot Sarah. And I never will, because sometimes the people we pick up on the road aren't looking for a ride. They're looking for someone to remember them, to make sure their story doesn't die with them. Some roads are haunted, not by ghosts or monsters, but by the choices we make, by the people we stop for and the ones we leave behind. If you've made it this far, maybe you understand that now. Maybe you'll think twice the next time you see someone standing on the side of the road in the middle of the night. Or maybe you won't. Maybe you'll stop, just like I did. And maybe you'll have your own story to tell. Thanks for listening. And remember, the road is always waiting.